a todos, bienvenidos a esta nueva edición de viernes de Soluciones Sostenibles del Consejo Colombiano de Construcción Sostenible. Como bien la mayoría sabe, o para los que es la primera vez, este es un espacio que hace parte de la agenda de formación del Consejo Colombiano de Construcción Sostenible, un espacio que desarrollamos semanalmente los viernes, donde siempre eh, traemos a ustedes temas relevantes asociados con construcción sostenible desde distintos actores de la cadena de valor y que les ayuda pues a fortalecer y conocer sobre ciertos temas que son del interés de ustedes. Hoy, digamos, tenemos como tema principal y un invitado muy especial que nos va a hablar sobre los aspectos ESG de una manera global, desde el estándar para Real Estate Funds and Portfolios de GRESB. Entonces, el día de hoy tenemos a Robert Slowko. Él se desempeña como ESG y director climático de GRESB. GRESB, igual como él ya nos contará, es una organización orientada a resultados con un enfoque hacia inversionistas que provee pues información relevante, como ya les comenté, en aspectos ESG o ASG por sus siglas en español, que es todo lo que comprende pues aspectos ambientales, sociales y de gobernanza o de buen gobierno corporativo. Robert pues tiene una experiencia muy interesante, muy amplia, digamos, relacionada pues con estos temas ESG de manera pues internacional, de manera pues también directa en algunos países como Estados Unidos. Y bueno, es una persona, como pueden ustedes ver, que cuenta con una experiencia importantísima y que nos quiere traer pues todo ese conocimiento en la conferencia de hoy. Les recuerdo, previo a darle la bienvenida y el acceso a Robert, que él pues nos va a compartir esta conferencia que va a ser en inglés. Yo acá, digamos, ya activé unos subtítulos que aquí les irán saliendo para que igual pues se puedan guiar los que de pronto no dominen el idioma del todo, pues ahí nos va a servir como orientación. Y una vez terminada pues, la presentación de Robert, la idea es poder tener un espacio de preguntas del público. Entonces, ideal si nos van dejando las preguntas en el chat y nosotros pues acá desde el consejo se las haremos a Robert en ese momento. ¿Listo? Entonces, pues no siendo más, doy la bienvenida a Robert. Hi, Robert. Welcome
Hola,
to this space. And well, go ahead with your presentation.
¿pueden ver mi presentación?
Sí, yes.
Muy bien. Buen día a todos. Muchas gracias. Consejo Colombiano de Construcción Sostenible. Muchas gracias a Juan David, Gaby, Ana y especialmente a Viviana y Angélica por invitarme. Soy responsable en GRESB por Estados Unidos de Oeste, Canadá de Oeste y toda la América Latina, incluyendo Colombia. Pero no voy a hablar todo el tiempo en español porque es mucho más fácil para mí describir todas las cosas que quiero decirles en inglés. Entonces, y me parece que también sería más interesante escuchar de todo en inglés. Entonces, cambiamos a inglés. So, hi everyone. I am here today to tell you a little bit more about GRESB and sustainability, specifically in the real estate sector, because this is what GRESB has been created for from the very beginning. So the initiative, has to be noted, started from the investors. That the investors, long time ago, that wanted to have better visibility, better transparency in terms of the ESG risks in the funds and the portfolios, real estate funds, that they were investing in. But they had no mechanism, no vehicle, no consistent uniform manner of kind of tracking those ESG risks. And the way they were thinking about those risks was about those risks in the mind had to be material. So think about, they obviously were getting all the financial type of information. They were getting all the financial statements. They were able to do all kinds of, financial modeling. But at the same time, they understood that in order to have a more holistic picture of the risks, they also needed to understand the extra financial risks or non-financial risks, which are, right now known as ESG risks, or environmental, social, and governance risks. But again, they wanted to see it through the material lens. What does it mean? They basically were interested in this type of risks that would have an impact if they were ever to materialize, if they would have an impact on the valuation, on the value, basically destruction of the funds and portfolios. So basically, there would be some kind of a damage to the portfolios and funds if those risks were to ever happen. And there are many different definitions of GRESB, but one that I would like you to kind of, stick with, perhaps, jot down some notes, remember, is that GRESB is the largest and the most comprehensive, the most thorough ESG risk assessment and benchmark that has been specifically designed for the real estate sector on the planet. There's nothing bigger. There's nothing more thorough than GRESB. So that's essentially, GRESB as a definition. We've grown substantially over the years. We actually started back in 2009, which is, in ESG terms, ancient history. And if you think about, those investors back then in 2009 that had this vision even of, considering this type of risks in their investments, that's extraordinary. As I joined the ESG journey. My first job in ESG was in 2014, which was still a very long time ago. And at the time, in the US, where I was, where I've been working, it was something, very unique, new. Very few people knew about, and so on. We started back in 2009. This GRESB assessment has been, and benchmark has been tested in fire, and there's been different phases of adoption, but in the last one, this third phase, we've seen a huge acceleration, a huge adoption, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more in a moment. Anyways, what I wanted to kind of leave you with as well, this framework, this assessment has been tested in fire. There's been loads of players that have become GRESB members, and they really value that. And there's been some adjustments over time because the world changes, but for the most part, it's very consistent over the years. The other way to kind of describe GRESB is that, you have, on the bottom, those portfolio managers, real estate portfolio managers. You have the operators of the real estate property. You have property managers. You have developers that want to have some kind of a consistent manner, consistent mechanism of measuring the ESG risk exposures. And they want to have it done by the third party, by an objective third party, a third party that is reputable, a third party that has that understands what potentially the investors may be sensitive to, and you can think of GRESB as this mechanism which is in the middle between those portfolio managers, operators, developers, property managers, and the investors. So we are sort of like this intermediary that creates this ability for those players to first understand their own ESG riskiness, their exposures, so to be able to measure that in some form that has been adopted, that has been recognized globally, as the best one to do that. And because of this, they can, if they can measure, they can manage their risks. And over time, they can monitor that, because it's like, you know, it's not a one-off kind of assessment. It's a continuous assessment over time. At the same time, GRESB, as I mentioned to you before, was created as an investor-led initiative. This is where the investors that want to have more transparency, more visibility in terms of ESG risks. And in many cases, many portfolio managers, many players in the real estate sector, they do GRESB because the investors are asking them to do that. And GRESB is a communication tool as well. So so think about the portfolio managers, think about all these players, you know, like that operate, you know, like as as organizers of the space, and they have to provide answers to that questionnaire that GRESB creates, and GRESB then puts together a report, which then they can use for themselves to assess themselves, and they can also share it with the investors, those ones that are sensitive, that are interested in getting this type of information. On the left-hand side, you've got the snapshot of, you know, like what the report sort of like looks like, the, you know, a couple of pages, 3 pages or so, but, you know, the reports are granular. GRESB is also an ecosystem. You know, think about us, you know, being here in the middle, you know, as this logo sort of indicates, and there are these 4 quadrants, and there are different stakeholders in GRESB that want to be part of GRESB for different reasons. So what are the reasons? So let's start from the investors, this 250 number. We have about 250 investor members of GRESB. And we started with just 3 in 2009. There's 250 that are formally associated with GRESB. These investors have the ESG considerations sort of ingrained, embedded in the policies, you know, in the investment policies. So whenever they think about, you know, any type of investment, they are also looking at the ESG exposures, and the mechanism for them to understand what the exposures are of those real estate managers, funds, portfolios is by asking for the GRESB report. And GRESB is also a communication tool and an analytical tool for them, and that's why they are part of GRESB. They have sort of like this front seat. This number is growing, and I'll show you in a moment, you know, like what type of investors we have, you know, like what type of names then. If we go down, this number 1,820, this is the number of participants. So this is the number of those funds and portfolios, those managers that provide those funds and portfolios to GRESB. So think about this quadrant as this would be the information providers, right? Like those fund managers, they provide us with the answers and based to the questions that we put together, and then based on that we can provide a report which then they can use for their own purposes and for sharing this with those investors. So those investors would be the information takers, and those participants would be information providers, and there's 1,820 of them globally. So it's a big number, really. Then if we move to this number 115, this is the number of partners. Partners are essentially, you can think of them as consultants. This would be the organizations that help those participants or to-be participants to get ready to GRESB. I don't know, your organization may be interested in joining GRESB, but you may not know how to start. And these are the organizations that are in a partner program, meaning that they are sort of certified by GRESB that, you know, they are competent in that. They have done it in the past. They have a track record. They know what they're doing. Some of them may specialize in this thing, then the other in some other things. Some may do everything, but they are consultants. We are sort of like giving them a label. Yes, you know, they are good to go, you know, like for the participants if they want to use them. Some may be already, you know, some companies may already be participants of GRESB. They still want to improve their standing. Those consultants can help. So that's this 115 number. It's growing actually very fast because it's a huge opportunity for many to provide their consulting services. And then if we go further up, this number 38, these are all kinds of associations, organizations that have a stake, vested interest in the success of GRESB. So, they operate in real estate. They want, they operate in some aspect of real estate. They want to drive sustainability in that sector. And they see GRESB as an important vehicle for that. And the example of that can be the organization that is organizing this event. So that's the equivalent of obviously Green Building Council in Colombia. And there's many others that are sort of like providing this thought leadership and guidance and education and insight. So that's the ecosystem. We are sort of like in the middle, we glue it together. Now, let's talk a little bit about, the investors, right? So we have 250 roughly right now. You can see an example of some of the names. Some of those names probably sound very familiar. Some of them are huge players. When we started, when GRESB started, there were 3 pension plans that drove this initiative, but it has grown to 250, and we not only have pension plans now, as investors, excuse me, we also have foundations, we have endowments, we have asset managers that allocate capital to real estate funds and portfolios. So these investors, roughly the ones that that are part of GRESB, excuse me, they represent about 22 trillion in English in assets under management. It's a huge pool of capital. And as I said, they think about investing in real estate sector through the prism of also sustainability. So beyond just pure financial considerations, they also take into consideration ESG. And the reason why they are in GRESB is because that gives them a good kind of seat at the table. And in some cases, they can even have an impact on the framework, on what we're asking, what kind of questions we're asking. They can change potentially, what the meaning of materiality is in ESG. And I'm happy to kind of share more, about that if you're interested. There are some investors that are still not formally associated with GRESB. They still use GRESB as the testing ground for whether they should invest or not in some specific real estate funds. They hopefully will become, formal investor members, and we're working on that. The other side, those information providers, as I told you, those funds and portfolios, there's also, like a snapshot of, different types of names. Some of them may be strikingly familiar for you. As of 2022, GRESB is an annual assessment. I told you that it's a continuous kind of assessment, but it happens once a year. So as of last year, as of 2022, we have 1,820 funds and portfolios globally, and they represent between 150 and 200,000 assets. So there's so many buildings in those portfolios, all kinds of. That's the situation in terms of the participants. GRESB is a global benchmark, and I've just put a few of those graphs here to kind of give you an insight, like how we have evolved, what's behind the curtains. So it has grown substantially. You can see in this graph in the top left hand corner how we have progressed over the year. So there's been growth every year, but there's an acceleration in growth, meaning acceleration in adoption of GRESB, simply because more people care about ESG and they recognize that GRESB is the best mechanism of understanding ESG exposures in the real estate sector. So, as I mentioned to you before, we ended up with 1,820 funds and portfolios of 2022. Probably we anticipate this year we're going to cross the 2,000 barrier. If we go further to the right, there's this horizontal bar chart, and these are, and it's a breakdown, which sectors are being represented. And really, they're all real estate sectors that are being represented in GRESB. There are no exceptions. Some of them more, some of them less, for the variety of reasons. But we're looking at the entire real estate. And then further to the right, you've got examples of some managers, some big managers that submit to GRESB, and the number of funds that they submit to GRESB as of 2022. The bottom graph, I think it's a very interesting one. It's a breakdown, regional breakdown, how different regions fare in terms of GRESB adoption over the years. Europe versus Americas, Africa and Asia, and so on. And the line that should be the most interesting for us is the red one. That's the one that represents Americas. So this is the one which is the second from the top. And yes, we are still lagging behind Europe. Think about, Europe, GRESB is an organization that started off in Europe, and Europe has been the leader in ESG, and the Americas are lagging. But the adoption is faster in the recent years in the Americas than it is already in Europe. And also we have deeper capital markets in the Americas overall, right? Like obviously US being this 800-pound gorilla. So GRESB has been growing in the recent years about 20% a year. And last year, for example, Americas, we grew at 30.5%. So we're like 30.5%. So we are growing faster than the global benchmark. One thing that I just wanted to I love this slide because it's just, it's based on the internal analysis of the funds in the Americas, groups of funds that joined GRESB in, different years, starting from 2013 all the way to 2022. You may know that GRESB, has a scoring system. So, there's the scoring scale is from 0 to 100, 100 being perfect score, 0 obviously conversely the worst. And some of the funds that are contemplating joining GRESB, they are concerned that they may not do so well when they join, and they don't want that visibility, like to versus vis-a-vis the investors, right? First of all, it's a myth, because what we see is that the investors, those ones that care about, ESG, those ones that are the investor members of GRESB, number one, and some that are interested in still using GRESB for their own purposes, they care about participation in the first place. And nobody expects that if a fund manager is going to join in year one, they're going to be a superstar. It's not going to happen. It never happened. It's too difficult to happen. It's the same as if you are, like I just, just this example kind of came to my mind that let's say you are a talented athlete and you join the Olympics for the first time, but you never really trained so much, and you expect to, win a medal. Probably you won't win any medal, in your first attempt. So it takes time. So for the first timers, what you're actually doing by, what you communicating when you join GRESB is that you are serious, dedicated, and committed to ESG in your work to your investors. That's what they can see, and that's what they care about. And they don't care so much about your score, because they know that they are not supposed to. It's not possible to think about this, like to get a very high score in year one. Over time, obviously they want you to grow, and you will grow. And you can see, for example, like those lines, that they all go to the top right-hand corner. And ultimately they end up, first of all, they are very steep, and then they flatten, and then they plateau in the low 80s somewhere. Low 80s, it's obviously we're looking at the aggregate average information for those funds. We don't share any individual funds scoring. right? We are protecting, those funds. It's just for them to use their report. But this is the aggregate information. So you can think of, in that group, there may be some that are scoring here, there may be some that are scoring here, but this is the average. This is the leading pack, right? This is where the investors want the fund managers to get to over a few years, but it's going to take a few years to get there. And even for the best ones, in terms of, the first year participants, such as, for example, 2016, they scored, I think, something like 63 in that year. They were still 20 points behind the leading pack. And it took them 5 years, like sometime in 2021, to join that leading pack. So even for the best, it takes a long time. One other kind of, like thought observation from this analysis is that you can see all these lines, they steeply grow from year one to the next year, the following year. And in the early years, in general, quite steeply. Why is that? Because doing GRESP is an education process. You simply learn tones in those initial years in terms of like what kind of questions we're asking, what kind of questions you can answer, which ones you cannot answer now but you can answer maybe next year. We do your entire gap analysis. You learn how to organize data collection, how to collect in the first place, how to organize it. You learn how to submit it. You learn how to manage time and so on. And also many of those qualitative questions that you're going to answer early, such as questions around policies, existence of those policies, and then providing evidence, and then procedures and so on, they're not going to change from this year to the next year, because and because of this, like you don't have to focus on them anymore. You just do them once, and maybe there may be some modifications. But if there's modifications, this is just cosmetic kind of, like changes the following years. So what you focus on is actually the gaps, things that you are unable to answer in year one, in year two, and this is how, you can accelerate. I guess, like the last observation, at least that I have from this analysis, is that the sooner a fund manager starts reporting to GRESP, the more advantage that they have vis-a-vis versus the peers and competitors. It takes about 2 to 3 years for those ones that are going to start 1 year behind you. Keep in mind, GRESP is an annual assessment, where it's not high frequency, to catch up to you. 2 to 3 years for the peers and competitors to catch up. And that's obviously very beneficial if you want to attract positive attention of the investors, because they want to invest in the funds that are not only financially sound and so on, but they are also very strong on the sustainability side. Moving on, GRESP, you can compare it in a way to an ISO standard. We're very granular. We provide, somebody I think drew some kind of a line here for me. So we are very thorough in terms of the assessment. It's very granular, it's very organized and coordinated. So expect like lots of very interesting kind of questions, and expect a lot of learning from that for your own purposes, identifying your own exposures, risks, those risks that should be addressed right away, because you weren't even aware of them, and they may be severe if they were ever to materialize. Those ones that may wait because they are not that severe, they are not that heavy, and they can wait, let's say, midterm, and there are some risks that that you may tackle long term because you don't have resources, and plus they are not that heavy, not that severe potentially. Flow of information. GRESP is again, portfolio and fund assessment, right? So we are not specifically focusing on the assets, on the buildings. I just want to contrast it with, let's say, with different types of building certifications, such as LEED, such as EDGE, BREEAM, etc. They focus on the buildings, and we use this information in our assessment, right? But this is just an element of the assessment. So we're looking at those assets and we're asking those questions. Do you have a certificate, like for this and the other asset, and some other asset related questions, but we then aggregate this information all the way to the fund level. And some of the questions would be focused on governance, governance of the fund, governance of the portfolio, social aspects that would also be pertaining perhaps more to the fund level than the property level. So that's how, the information flows. At the same time, what is really important to understand is that if a portfolio has, let's say, 10 assets and you only have data on 5, you still report on 10 assets, and you just tell us that you have only information and data on 5, which is perfectly fine. Next year, maybe you're going to have it on 6. Next following year, maybe on 7, and so on. That's how it goes. This is how we see this improvement. And other than that, you can see on this pyramid that that's the communication tool. GRESB is an analytical tool. There's lots of analysis. You can slice and dice the data, your own exposure. It's a benchmark, so you can compare and contrast yourself with the best in class. You can educate yourself, but it's also a mechanism to communicate with typically the investors. You can also communicate with your peers if they're also willing to get into this mechanism, this exchange. But that's how it works. Last thing that I just wanted to kind of comment is that for some of you that are new to ESG, you may be overwhelmed, sometimes a little bit dizzy by the number of acronyms in that space. ESG in the first place is an acronym. So so you just see all these different names, all these different acronyms. Like, what do I do with them? Like, which one should I do? Which one shouldn't I do? Why should I do this one and not the other one? And what do they all mean, right? Like, so these acronyms actually represent different types of frameworks. They represent different types of regulatory requirements. They represent organizations and associations that have different types of purposes. And one thing that I would like to leave you with, if you're a fund manager or you're an investor allocating to real estate, the most comprehensive, thorough assessment and benchmark is GRESB for real estate. It's been specifically dedicated to that. If you do GRESB, you're still going to align yourself with other frameworks such as SASB, this one, or GRI. They were created more cross-sectoral. So they were, designed to kind of identify risks regardless of, which sector you're operating in. GRESB was specifically designed for real estate. And then we also morphed into, an infrastructure assessment. But the bar is much higher in terms of what GRESB is doing in terms of ESG versus, the others such as SASB or GRI. And in many cases, so when you do GRESB, you can feed, your alignment to SASB and GRI. You cannot do it, the other way. And then GRESB can also help you in respect to regulatory compliance. That landscape is changing, and there's going to be much more regulations also in Colombia, I expect. But there's huge push in the EU, in the European Union, and there's some start in the US, some other countries such as Brazil, in Latin America, in Mexico, and so on. So loads is going on, and GRESB can help you a lot in terms of various types of reporting schemes and compliance. So whether it be regulatory compliance or participation in different types of organizations and reporting to those organizations, such as PRI, this one that is here, and with TCFD. So with this, I'm not going to bore you more, on the subject. If you would like to spend some time, one-on-one with me, and you're not feeling comfortable, asking questions here in public and, getting my maybe more general answers, then you can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to kind of spend some time and answer your questions and delve deeper into what is GRESB, what is the assessment, what's the process, what the challenges are, etc., etc. With this, I say gracias, and we can just like open up the questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. All the information that you tell us about GRESB is so important to the value chain. And we received some questions about your presentation. And remember to the audience in the chat, please put the questions that you need. So the first question, Robert, is, one moment, please. Robert, how do you see the progress of a market such as Latin America?
So how do I see? So first of all, Latin America is, you know it better than I. I'm not Latin American. I'm actually Polish, but I've lived in the States for quite a long time. But I have connection to the market through my personal kind of relations for a long, long time. Latin America is not a uniform market, and there are pockets of like different types of development. Different countries are on different stage of development and also adoption of ESG or sustainability standards. And I'd say the leaders in Latin America are the big economies. So think about Brazil, think about Mexico. There's, I would say Chile is on the forefront because, it's obviously a pretty developed, like Latin American country. And I think I can see a lot of interest, like coming from Colombia. Colombia is in earlier stage than Chile, for example, than Brazil or Mexico. But I'd say these would be the leaders in respect to the adoption of sustainability, broadly speaking.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Another questions about the reports of GRESB. These reports are public?
So in the benchmark, what I mentioned to you, like on a few times, that we have this over 1,800 participants right now. Majority of them, vast majority, 80%, in fact, are private companies. Those reports are not public. They are private, right? Those companies, typically private companies, they are not obliged, they are not required to report anywhere. I mean, the regulations simply are much more loose for private companies. And our benchmark is predominantly, like dominated by the private companies. So we protect the privacy of those reports. It's in fact the decision of like those companies that join GRESB, how they're going to use those reports, whether they're going to use bits and pieces of the report in the webinars, seminars, in the brochures, marketing materials, or they're going to use the entire reports when they, let's say, go to, I don't know, speak with investors. They can do whatever they want with them. They can even post those reports on the website to make it super public, right? But it's up to them. We, as GRESB, and this is also the, I guess, the recognition, the reputation that we have, and that's all what we have really, outside of, of the process of the diligence, is that we protect the privacy of all these participants that join GRESB. And even if some company becomes an investor member, so obviously wants to have this front seat to get access to those reports, they still have to request those reports from those participants. So they have to virtually sort of like knock on their door, and the person who is the the account administrator is going to get a notification. Hey, some investor wants to see your report, and then that person who is that guardian is going to say yes or no, right? So it's really up to them.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Another question. This is a question about a one company. That is a case. For example, Once Real Estate is a Colombian company that will aim to repurpose an inefficient office building into residential real estate. Being a very young company, when does it make sense to become a member of GREST? Or, or when is the moment to become a member of GREST?
So the way I kind of understood, because you were breaking a little bit, but like, they have a residential kind of like assets, and they converting those assets, office assets, and they converting them to residential, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So look, I mean, like they will probably qualify as development because GRESP does both. In this case, it's redevelopment, readjustment, like it's obviously, like it's repurposing of the real estate asset. We have both. We assess operational assets, so assets that are being currently, leased out, and they are, obviously completed and leased. And we also have the development component for those assets that are being in different stages of development. And this repurposing would be the basically development stage. As I said before, GRESP is not high frequency. It's an annual assessment. So in 2023, in this cycle that we are in, we are assessing calendar year 2022. So the state of affairs, how your assets looked like in 2022. If they were at the time office assets, they would be assessed as office. If they were already in the redevelopment stage, then you would just apply the development and you would essentially build the track record. And I think it's very important. And what is considered in the development phase? Well, what you aim to do, right? Like, what's the, like, what are you trying to basically build or rebuild? So this would be the questions. This is what they would center around. I'd say the sooner you start, the better you go, the better off you're going to be, because it's also a learning process. And there's something called a grace period in year one. So the grace period, think about it as a curtain that you would cover yourself with. And nobody's going to even see that you did GRESP, but you're learning the process. And then in year two, when you don't have the grace period anymore, your investors, whoever, the interested parties are going to see that your firm participates in GRESP. That's all. That's all what they're going to see. They're not going to see your score, nothing, right? Like your firm, your fund participates in GRESP. And then they may be interested in, how you're doing. But you're already going to be doing much better in year two, because you've already learned under the grace period how to do GRESP. And you've done a lot of heavy lifting back then. So always good to start early, because I'll give you one more example. This process ends up with report that is being produced by GRESP every year. The report gets produced early October. So in 2023, we're going to produce those reports in October, probably like around 1st of October, 2023. If you miss this train this year, you're going to see your first report in October 2024. It's 1.5 years from now. It's a long time. In my view, it may be a wasted opportunity, but it's obviously, everybody's individual decision. All I can do is educate and provide all the information.
Okay, thank you, Robert. One more question. What role do sustainable building certifications and how do they relate to GRESP? Not only about infrastructure, so building.
Yes, so the certificates are an element of the GRESP assessment. So we're going to ask all kinds of questions related to assets, questions related to water consumption, energy, efficiency and consumption. We would be looking at the waste generation. We would be looking at greenhouse gas emissions. We also would be looking at the certifications. And there's a bunch of building certifications, and there are guidelines within GRESB, like assessment, which ones we honor, and there's a bunch of them. So, so it's an important element, but it's one of the elements that we're going to be asking for.
Okay, thank you, Robert. No sé si alguien más del público tenga una última pregunta para Robert. Si no, pues las estaremos recibiendo de todas maneras en cualquier momento, se las hacemos llegar a él de manera directa y recomendarles, como bien nos dice acá Gabriela en el chat, contestar la encuesta recibida para poder tener pues una opinión de ustedes respecto al presente webinar. So, Robert, we don't have any more questions. So, thank you very much for all the information that you give us. When I say it's more important to the all value chain and the audience that have presence in the space.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for your attention, for inviting me, for everybody's attention, and for wonderful questions. I understand there's maybe many more questions that you may have, and I'm happy to answer them. Please reach out to me. And if you have a trouble of, finding my email, then I guess, you can ask Juan and David, or, folks from CCCS.
Robert, sorry, we have a one more question. Sure. Where we can find the cost, the GRESB cost?
Where can you find what? GRESB what?
The cost to apply.
Oh, the fees. Let's talk about it. So if somebody's interested in the cost, let's just talk about it, because I just want to understand also, the landscape, what they're asking for. There's a little bit more detail to that.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
It's not much though, guys. It's not much comparing to what the consultants are charging, etc. So.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So well, muchas gracias a todos por conectarse a este espacio. Muchas gracias, Robert, por la presentación. Y bueno, los esperamos a todos en un nuevo viernes de soluciones sostenibles. Sepan que de parte del Consejo Colombiano de Construcción Sostenible, pues vamos a estar muy atentos a lo que puedan tener dudas o tener pues ese contacto directo con GRESB, con Robert, pues acá estaremos muy atentos. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Thank you, Robert.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.